Welcome to Chapter 11. In this chapter, we're covering an introduction to CSS and styling text. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And one thing that you need to know is exactly what the cascading is. Well, cascading style sheets allows you to apply basic styles to a website. Up to now, we've basically added text and paragraph tags, div tags, and other semantic tags to allow you to add content to the page. Now, with cascading style sheets, you can add styling to your page, such as colored backgrounds, colored text, even if you get into more advanced CSS, animations, and other items that allow for interactivity. So if you take this basic page right here with some sample text on it, and you apply a cascading style sheet, you can see that it can completely transform the text on the page, allowing for pictures, different designs, different colors, and even different fonts. The good thing about cascading style sheets is that by using the same HTML file, you can change the CSS, or cascading style sheets, and come up with a whole new different design. The actual HTML has not changed, but thanks to the CSS, now we have a completely different design. And that even goes for something a little more interactive and something a little more beyond the basic standards. On top of this, it also allows for resizing and going into mobile environments so that the page can automatically resize itself so that it works for mobile environments such as tablets and phones, instead of having to create a secondary site with all the same data. So let's talk about style. Of course, cascading style sheets has the word style in it, so what exactly does style allow you to do? Well, first it allows you to bold items that you would otherwise use the B tag for, but in this case just for styling purposes, not semantic purposes. You can make text italic. You can underline text with or without a link. You can change colors for the text. You can make the text larger. You can make the text smaller. You can change the font variants such as small caps. You can even add text shadow, change the font families themselves, and even change the text alignment. All of this you can do with basic CSS. So let's talk about the cascade and inheritance. Basically, the cascade portion of cascading style sheets and inheritance of how the different cascading portions go between the different sections on the site. First thing is you have, of course, your HTML styling. This is the basic concept of it, and this is the basic inheritance of the actual page. Inside the HTML, you have the body. The body has its own inheritance. Below that is the main. Below that, in this example, is an unordered list and list items. All of these items inherit the stylings of their parent element. For example, if you said something that stylizes the HTML page, that would go all the way down through all the content, including the body, main, and list items. So basically, everything is the child of a parent element, and the child inherits the styling of the parent. I can get into a little more detail, but chances are it's a little too jargony for what we're going to do, so I'm not going to go over that. Once we get into CSS, you need to know some basic CSS anatomy, such as the rule, selector, declaration, property, value, and a declaration block. The first item we have is a CSS rule, and a CSS rule is a single block of code that highlights one or more elements. For example, one CSS rule may color all the paragraph text red, while the other rule changes the background color and font size in a footer. The following rule sets the font size of all the H1 elements and creates a drop shadow on the text. I'll go over the exact details of what these are in just a minute. Rules start with a selector and end with a right closing curly brace. The selector and curly brace should be aligned to each other. The spacing itself is more of just a handy developer tooltip instead of a requirement. Once you get into more advanced CSS and you have multiple rules on one page, you want to make sure all the curly braces are lined up appropriately with the closing brace and the selector. Speaking of selectors, in this example, the H1 is the selector itself. As I mentioned before, the selector and the closing curly brace should be lined up, but the selector is the first part of the rule. It specifies which HTML element or elements are able to receive the styling. You can add different elements by grouping them, by creating child elements, and even more advanced selectors we'll get to in later chapters. This kind of selector targets a specific HTML element. The selector in the figure, H1, is a type selector that selects or targets every H1 on the page or site. Next is a declaration. In this case, we have two declarations in this example. But a declaration is a single line that instructs the browser to apply some styling. Declarations should be indented under the selector, and each one should end with a semicolon for better practice. Declarations are composed of two parts, a property and a value. A rule can have as many declarations as you like. Speaking of property and value, each of these declarations have the property that is in purple and the value that is in green and gold. So a property is a characteristic such as color or font size. Certain properties are only applicable to certain elements. A property is immediately followed by a colon, a space, and finally its value. It is common to alphabetize declarations by property. Meanwhile, a value defines how a property is styled. Values may contain numbers of measurement like 16 pixels or 75%, keywords like top, color values, or other information. Depending on the property, it may have a single value or multiple values. To give a good example, the font size only has one value. Meanwhile, the text shadow needs those 4 different values in one value selector. Meanwhile, everything inside the rule is considered a declaration block. A declaration block is the block of all declarations in a rule. The declaration block resides inside the curly braces. One element or one item can have multiple declarations, but it's a better practice to have all the rules for a single element inside one declaration block. That's it for this chapter. This is just a basic introduction. In the next video, we'll talk about adding CSS and the different ways to do so. If you have any questions, please let me know via email or Twitter, and I'll get back to you the best way I know how.